People often say you're either a STEM person or a social science and humanities person. And I feel like I've actually always been very interested in both. And a lot of my life has been trying to bridge the two. So in college, originally I was going to double major in sociology and computer science. In the end, I ended up doing a major in computer science and a concentration in sociology, which is basically an elevated minor, which is what they call it at Columbia. But yeah, I was always very deeply interested in the two. And I was looking for intersections, which is kind of how I found my way into research. And so the first research projects that I did were coming from what's called natural language processing.
From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and this is AI and Public Health, intersection of computer science and sociology.
You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
Is AI the future? Some may argue that it is the present and here to stay. The question is, does public health really know how to tap into its full potential? To help make sense of all of this, I've invited Dr. Serina Chang, whose research is at the cutting edge of the intersection of AI, public health, and social sciences to better understand human behavior and guide data-driven policymaking. She recently completed her PhD in computer science at Stanford University and will be a postdoc from 2024 to 2025 at Microsoft Research NYC. Serina is an incoming assistant professor at UC Berkeley, and her work has been published in top-tier scientific journals and has received coverage in over 650 news outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. We start off this conversation with Serina talking about her background in music, her academic pathway at some of the top universities in the US, and ultimately, how she saw an opportunity to combine computer science and social sciences.
Serina, welcome to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to have you on because I think for the last year or two, well, in my kind of space anyway, AI has been dominating the discourse in my conversation bubbles as well as maybe the broader public. And I think while AI probably has a more robust history in other sectors, it's still sort of new-ish in sort of the health sector. So I think when I came across someone with your background, which we'll get into as we go through this podcast, I was very intrigued to kind of unpack a lot of things for people who are a little bit scared of approaching the AI conversation. There's a lot of concepts, a lot of terminology, and a lot of different applications and limitations that people aren't as aware of because it's quite new to the space that we exist in public health. So I'm really excited to unpack those with you.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited.
But before we do that, as is customary for all of our podcast episodes, we like to dig a little bit deeper into the person first, the career that you chose, and understanding how everything unfolded as you were a high school, a teenager, the interests and thoughts that you had at the time, and then the current space that you exist. So really understanding if at that age, did you ever think you'd be in academia doing some really cool stuff in AI and computational this and all these buzzwords that I can't pronounce. So I want to take us back and approach it as if it was a Google Maps with a lot of different stops and trips added on, right? And we're going to come off and talk about each of those trips so that people can have a better understanding of the career that you chose. And there's a lot of people too who listen to the podcast who are about to enter the field of public health or aspiring or in high school. What we try to do with this medium is to shed light on the various possibilities in public health and then how that intersects with other sectors, industries, disciplines. Because even when I told my parents I was going to go into public health, it's kind of like, what's that? And it's not a doctor, a lawyer, nurse with a very discrete fields. And then when you kind of mash different disciplines, it gets even more complicated and mind-blowing. So I'm really excited to go through this with you. So the first thing that I thought was super interesting was, and I did notice it immediately when you joined the room too, that you do have a keyboard in the background there. So it tells me that you still maintain an interest and you're still active in music.
That's
How did
right.
that interest come about? Like, and when did that start?
Yeah. So I've always loved music. I actually started piano when I was around 5 years old. I have a sister who is 3 years older than me, and she was already playing piano and she was giving her first concert. And as the story goes, which my mom tells me, I saw my sister come out dressed as a little fairy or something. It might have been like a Halloween concert. She was wearing fairy wings. She got on stage. She played her little piece. There's a spotlight on her. Everybody clapped. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to dress up and have people clap for me. So I think that was the origin of it. I asked my mom to let me take piano lessons too, but quickly that blossomed into an actual love for music itself. And so from, I think, like 5 years old until the end of high school, I was quite serious about music. There was a while when I thought I might become a professional pianist.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. So to answer your earlier question, I definitely didn't always know that I would end up in academia doing computational health. There was a while when I was younger when I thought I'd become a professional classical pianist. And over summers, I would often go to music festivals.
wow.
And I was going to Manhattan School of Music for a long time as well in New York City, which is where I grew up.
So you mentioned for a while you thought that would have been the direction. What kind of knocked you into something else? Did that unfold naturally? How did that change come about?
Yeah, I mean, I still love music, as you can see. I'm definitely not as serious about it anymore, but my sister and I played especially a lot of two piano together when we were growing up. So both of us played piano. And so we would either play four hands, which is where you have one keyboard and four hands on the keyboard.
Right.
But when we had the space and when we had two pianos to play with, we would actually play on two pianos at once, which is quite fun because you can imagine all of the sort of sounds and the richness of that because one keyboard is already so powerful. So oftentimes, for example, they'll arrange a symphony or some sort of orchestral piece for two pianos because it's really only two pianos that can capture an entire orchestra of instruments. So just to talk about music a little more. But yeah, I think around 15 or so, I decided instead of trying to go to a conservatory, which would be the next track for like a professional musician, to go to college instead. And I think that was largely because of the classes I was taking in school. I took AP Computer Science in my senior year and really fell in love with it. I had a really good social studies teacher as well, which is where my interest in sociology arose. And those were the two things that I studied in college. So I think I thought like I can continue music in college, but I also want to be studying these fields and to possibly like do a career in those instead.
That's a great segue to the next point. You did your bachelor's degree in computer science and sociology from Columbia University. You talked about leaving high school with an interest in social studies as well as computer science.
Yeah.
So at the time as you were transitioning into university from high school, did you have an understanding of how you might go about connecting the two, or were there distinct interests at the time where you weren't quite sure how to combine them and then that unfolded over time? How did that play out?
People often say you're either a STEM person or a social science and humanities person. And I feel like I've actually always been very interested in both. And a lot of my life has been trying to bridge the two. So in college, originally, I was going to double major in sociology and computer science. In the end, I ended up doing a major in computer science and a concentration in sociology, which is basically an elevated minor, which is what they call it at Columbia. But yeah, I was always very deeply interested in the two. And I was looking for intersections, which is kind of how I found my way into research. And so the first research projects that I did were coming from what's called natural language processing subfield. I don't want to get into too many definitions yet, but natural language processing is sort of a subfield of artificial intelligence that is largely focused on human language. And I always found natural language processing, or NLP for short, really fascinating because it allowed me to explore the combination of my interests and specifically treating language as a lens through which we can study the social world. So understanding social meaning in language, how people communicate social norms, and how those norms are actually like hidden in all the things that we say, using language as a lens on the social world, but then to study such language, developing really advanced technological tools coming from natural language processing. And so there's a whole subfield of artificial intelligence that is focused on language. And so it's this really unique opportunity to combine both my computational as well as my social interests.
And while you were at Columbia University, were there similar people to you in terms of wanting to bridge the two, or is that like a path that you more or less ended up carving out on your own, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think computer science and sociology was rare. I don't think I knew anyone who studied specifically that combination. I had a few friends who were similarly interdisciplinary. I had a friend, I think, who was studying like English and computer science, and she was one of my closest friends in college. There's also like people from the computer sciences, like my advisor, Kathy McEwen at Columbia, who was mainly in natural language processing, but using it and developing it to study social questions. And so I gravitated towards these sort of socially minded computer scientists. And then on the flip side, there were sociologists who were studying things from a quantitative perspective. So they still identified as sociologists, but maybe they did like social networks, for example. And I did some work with Peter Behrman at Columbia, who has done some really seminal work in social networks and the more quantitative side of sociology.
So you eventually went on to have some kind of experience at Google in software engineering. Was that an opportunity you sought out specifically because of that budding interest? And what type of work did you end up doing in that internship?
Yeah, so I interned twice at Google. And definitely even when I was at Google, I was interested in doing projects that were more socially oriented with some sort of social impact, or at least touching products that users will use themselves. I also just broadly was interested in doing these internships because it's like a very common path for people who do CS majors to end up going into like some sort of software engineering job at a big tech company. And so I wanted to try it out for myself. So some summers I did research, some summers I did internships, and I was really trying to figure out after college, do I want to go into grad school or not? And so it was part of this sort of exploration that I did these internships. But even within the internships, when I was choosing projects, like I remember telling managers that I wanted to do stuff related to users and social impact. So for example, one summer I was working on Google Search. And so Google Search, one of the most common products. And specifically, I was on the local team, which is basically the combination of search plus Google Maps. So it's like when you look up something on search, but you have some sort of like geographical result. So like restaurants near me, or where can I, like pharmacies or whatever. And so you're on search, but you get back these geographical results. And I was working on projects related to that.
So in talking to you for 10 plus minutes now, I think it's become clear why you ultimately then took the next step of pursuing a PhD in computer science, and with a kind of social science lens that you kind of described there. So then talk to me a little bit about the work that you ended up doing in your PhD and how that maybe evolved over time as a candidate in year one to when you ultimately finished your PhD, which I believe was fairly recently.
Yeah. I walked in graduation in June, so just a few months ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So definitely some transitions once I started my PhD. So I started in 2019, right after undergrad. So I went straight from undergrad to the PhD at Stanford. When I came in originally, I thought I'd be doing more of the natural language processing kind of work that I just described. But in my first quarter, so Stanford runs on the quarter system. In my first quarter at Stanford, I took a class called Machine Learning with Graphs, who was taught by who would eventually become my advisor. And I realized I loved graphs. I fell in love with graphs. Graphs are also known as networks. I'm happy to maybe explain what a network is now. It's a good time.
Go for it.
Cool. So I think the most canonical example of a network would be like a social network. And so we've probably all seen those pictures that are essentially like webs, right? It kind of looks like a web. And more formally, to define a network, it consists of both nodes and edges. And so in a network, a node would be, for example, an individual. And then the edges describe relationships between the nodes. So in a social network, the edges would represent, say, friendships between people. And you can even go into more detail in terms of how strong is that friendship. Maybe you could quantify that by how many times a week do you talk? Or if you were to rank your friends in terms of like, who would you go to for advice? Like you can get all sorts of fancy things over these networks, but in its most basic form, it's just nodes and edges. So nodes define some sort of entity like people, and then edges define the relationships between people like friendship. So social networks are this canonical example, but something we're going to talk about a lot more in this episode is contact networks, which is very applicable to public health and infectious diseases. And so a contact network, in those, the nodes are still people, but the edges now represent physical contact between people. And depending on what kind of network you're interested in, maybe for COVID, what you care about is contact in a way that COVID could have spread over that sort of contact. So maybe it's that they sat in the same restaurant, or they sat on the same bus, or maybe they're neighbors and they were in the elevator together at the same time. And so the kind of contact that you describe can vary based on what kind of network you're interested in. For more like sexually transmitted diseases, then the edges that you care about are actual possibilities for sexual transmission. And so these networks are these really flexible forms in which we can describe all sorts of relationships that we have with each other. So that's basically a network. I got very interested in them. I think I got interested in them for a number of reasons. I think it, again, spoke to both the social and computational side of my brain. In terms of social, I think it's obvious. Like it's actually allowing you to describe social interactions with people. And specifically, it allows you to describe both these very micro interactions. Like I was saying, literally, like for me, how many people do I talk to in a given week? And you can actually write that out in a sort of data format. But at the same time, you can also zoom out and look at the entire network at once, right? Like we can look at the entire network for the US or the entire network for my freshman class at Columbia. And when you zoom out, you get these really interesting macroscopic insights about the network. So you might have heard of, for example, like the small world phenomenon, which is that you can reach anybody else in the network with a surprisingly few number of steps. Right. So it's like the sort of 6 degrees of separation. At the same time, we also have a lot of clustering in the network. And so if you have a friend and then you have another friend, those two friends are very likely to be friends with each other. And so you have both this very microscopic view of like, who are Serina's friends and are they friends with each other? But also at a global scale, how quickly could any randomly sampled person in this network reach Serina? Right. And so like networks, I feel like are just this really beautiful way to describe both the micro and the macro of the social world, which I really liked. And then from the computational side, because they are described in this sort of discrete format where you can talk about the nodes and the edges, there's a whole very rich literature of graph theory, which is very mathematical and probabilistic, as well as on the more computational side, there's a whole field called graph machine learning, which is basically machine learning for network and graph structured objects. And my advisor was one of the leading people in that area. And so, again, like natural language processing, but even more so, it was something that spoke to me both from a social as well as a computational side. And so I decided to go all in on graphs or all in on networks. So yeah, that was like the first year of my PhD. I decided to pivot into networks. So then I decided to start working with that guy who was teaching machine learning with graphs. This is Yuri Leskovic at Stanford. And when we were working together, this was like within the first 3 months of us working together, March 2020 is when the COVID pandemic hit. And this was during the first year of my PhD at Stanford. And I flew home to New York a few weeks into March. And I was like, okay, I'm going to bunker down here and see what happens. And that's when we decided to start doing some work related to the pandemic, because we were recognizing that this was a really unique moment where academia needed to pitch in and we needed to see what we could do to help fight this global pandemic, but also be very aware at the same time about our positionality as computer scientists, as data scientists, and as network scientists. What is our unique contribution that we can make, while also keeping in mind all of the other contributions that other fields are making, and how can we provide complementary strengths and build on what everyone else is doing.
So I'm going to come back to that because in preparing for this episode, I saw you speak a lot about using mobility data to predict different outcomes in terms of how disease spread and things like that. And I was really curious. And I think I'm guessing that's probably was part of your PhD work. So I'm excited to get into that too. But in hearing you describe this, it's clear that you have this research interest that always has sat with you for a period of time. but
Mhm.
also in doing my research on you, you're very
Mhm.
passionate about sharing knowledge and teaching as well. And
Mhm.
I did
Mhm.
saw that you were involved with a Girls Who Code
Yeah,
program.
that's
Can you
right.
talk? I think that was a really cool. I'm not sure how long you were teaching in that, but I just wanted to
Yeah.
shout it out and give you a chance to describe what that experience was like and the
Yeah.
purpose of the program, who goes to that, what types
Mhm.
of things you
Thank you.
talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to talk about it.
Hmm.
It is one of the most rewarding experiences I've had. So this was summer before I started my PhD, so summer of 2019.
Hmm.
And I had the opportunity to be the primary instructor for Girls Who Code, a summer immersion program in New York City. And so it's basically a 7-week program for students who are learning to code for the first time. And so these are complete
Hmm.
beginners, people who have
Hmm.
really never coded before. And we worked with the Girls Who Code curriculum that really starts from the beginning. It starts with
Mm,
this coding language called Scratch. I don't know if you've ever looked at Scratch,
no.
but it's a great way to learn how to code if you've never coded before. It basically turns coding into this sort of building blocks exercise. So it has this really nice graphical interface where you can basically drag and drop blocks where, for example, you might have like a for loop block, meaning like
Wow.
you drag and drop the for, and then you can say like for, I don't know, like if you wanted to basically have a program that said count to 5,
Mhm.
and when you're at 1, like print out the number 1, when you're at
Mhm.
2, print out the number 2, and so on.
Right, right.
Like this program will allow you to do that in a very like visually understandable
Wow.
way. So you can like drag and drop the for loop, and then you can say like print I or
Right,
something.
right, right.
And it's quite a nice
Like an
educational
accessible
language.
way for coding a
Mhm.
little bit. Mm.
Yeah, exactly. So we started with Scratch, and then we did Python for a while, which I think is one of the more accessible coding languages.
Mhm.
Like some of Python just literally sounds like English. And so I think that was a nice accessible language. We did some web coding, which I think the
Mhm.
students enjoyed a lot because like HTML, CSS,
Right, right.
JavaScript. And I think what's rewarding about those languages is that you can see the results of your coding like almost immediately. Like if
Right,
you're
right.
like, if you code like drop a big red rectangle here, like
Right,
you're going to
right.
see a big
I see that.
rectangle show up on your website.
Right.
So it's very like visually responsive. So we did a little bit of that. We did a little bit of robotics. And then at the end, the students all did final projects where they got to choose what they worked on, and they could like put to work all of the things that they had learned over the last 6 weeks.
That's awesome. Is that program still running? Is that
I think Girls Who Code is. I'm not
yeah.
sure if the summer immersion
Right,
program
right.
specifically is. I hope
Right.
so.
Sounds like a
Yeah, I
really
had a really
cool.
great time with it. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm like LinkedIn friends with some of my students, and I can see that they've like gone on to do CS majors or like to run CS clubs at their schools.
Right.
So I think it really does instill a love for computation early on.
Awesome. And then right now, I think you're in the middle of a postdoc at
Yeah.
Microsoft.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that piece as well?
Sure. Yeah. So I think relatedly, in the last year of my PhD, I decided that I wanted to be a faculty next. And so I went on what's called the faculty job market. I like went around to different schools, gave job talks, and eventually decided to go to Berkeley. So I'm very excited to be joining Berkeley next year as an assistant professor, and I'll be joint appointed in the CS and also in what's called computational precision health. It's this new program that Berkeley has, which is basically what it sounds like. It's about integrating computational methods into health, both more individualized medicine as well as population health.
Ooh.
And that's really where I'll be contributing on the population health side. So yeah, I'm really excited about that joint appointment. That's really at the intersection of my interests. But I did what is quite common these days, which is after accepting the position, I deferred by a year.
Right.
And so I won't be starting at Berkeley until July of next year. But for now, I'm going to be a postdoc at Microsoft. And so I'm a postdoc at Microsoft Research. I'm still figuring out exactly what I'll be working on,
Right.
but it's just a great opportunity to get to know people at Microsoft Research and get to see what they're really working on with real data and real products and real users. So I think I'll definitely be doing something related to that.
Awesome. And then at UC Berkeley,
Yeah.
and when you start you're being an assistant professor there,
Yeah.
do you know what courses you're going to be teaching, or like if it's going to be similar to the research that you're doing now, you're going to be doing it? Can you shed some light on that? Yeah.
Yeah. So the research will definitely be a continuation of what I'm doing now. And I'm happy to describe my research more holistically. I think I've touched on it here and there, but really continuing at this intersection of AI, public health, and social science is where my research falls. So I'll continue doing that sort of research. In terms of classes, I think I'm excited to bring that to the course curriculum as well. And so maybe have a more socially minded graduate seminar for both CS and other related students. I haven't quite decided what it'll be called yet. I probably won't teach it until maybe my first or second semester when I'm there. And then I think on the computational precision health side, doing maybe some sort of population health class.
Okay. All right. So more to follow on that next year, it seems.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to switch gears a bit before going into the subject matter. And I'm going to surprise you with this segment because in the email, I didn't say this was going to happen, but I promise you'll enjoy it. It's a rapid fire segment. It's called Inside Blitz. We use this segment to ask questions or read statements and basically get your brief response or reactions to what we say. It'll take like 2 minutes, but I'm excited to throw you some curveballs and see what you say there. So let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, ready.
Ready? All right. First thing, simple enough. Favorite thing to do in your spare time?
I play with my cats a lot. They're currently in the room because I didn't want them to come out during the recording
I wouldn't
session.
even notice. Yeah.
They make themselves known. They're Siamese cats, so they're pretty vocal. So they cry like babies, but they're very sweet. We have 2 little girls. They're sisters, and their names are Mu and Sigma. So they're named after the probability distribution.
I'm glad you shared their names. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Favorite food?
I like noodles a lot. All sorts of noodles. I think noodle soup. I'm a big ramen fan. I like udon. I like spaghetti as well. Like noodles across cuisines. But I like a good noodle.
All right. So I think it's clear from when we started talking that you have and still continue to play piano. But what's your favorite musical instrument to listen to? Understanding that obviously in an orchestra or whatever, there's multiple, but do you have one that kind of hits different from you other than the piano?
Yeah, the cello. I think the cello is gorgeous. I think there's a certain yearning that you can do with the cello, the sort of deeper tones, the long drawn out vibratos. I think, a good cello piece.
I'm a sucker for music. I wish if I could go back and talk to my younger self, I would say, go do something in music. I just enjoy it so much. But I'm not skilled in that area. So I live vicariously through people like you who play really well and these beautiful, amazing sounds.
Thank you.
The next one is true or false. You have sung in a chamber choir.
True.
Tell me about that experience.
I did chamber choir in high school, so nothing professional. But we had the overall chorus, which anybody in the high school could join, and then there's like the chamber choir, which is a smaller group of people. Yeah, I love chamber choir. I think it was usually like 10 to 20 or so students. I don't know how many they have these years, but it's usually quite a bit smaller. Sometimes you do a cappella, and so that means having no accompaniment. There was also a tradition every year that all of the girls would come together, and then all the boys in chamber choir would come together, and they would do like a sort of a competition where they would like arrange their own thing, and the teacher had nothing to do with it. And so we would get quite into that. I think it was only the seniors who would do that, and they would usually arrange some sort of mashup of 2 popular pop songs at the time.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Worst piece of advice? I think I've maybe related to what I was saying like at the beginning of the episode. I think people sometimes assume that you can only be in STEM or social science / humanities. And so the suggestion that you have to choose one or the other. I've been trying to go against that advice for my whole life. And so, I guess in the end, in some ways I did like choose to be in a CS PhD, but then the PhD I did was pretty untraditional and very much focused on society and various application areas. And then now, in my professor position, I'm also joint appointed. So there is a way to bridge these things.
There you go. Last one, key piece of advice that you would give to students or aspiring professionals looking to go into a similar line of work as you?
I think, let's see. I mean, there's a lot of things, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that I reflect on lately is, and this might sound cliche, but genuinely doing what you love.
Mm-hmm.
I think research is when you do a research project, you think about it, and you need to think about it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, you think about it when you wake up, you think about it in the shower, you think about it when you're sitting at your desk. And so if you don't actually like the topic very much and you're doing it, for example, because it's the trendy thing, that will get old after a while. I think you should, and also because, especially if you're in CS, if you choose to be in academia, you are giving up on being in industry, for example, where you could get paid a lot more and have a lot of direct impact on product and users. And so I think you should only choose academia out of a labor of love, I think, if you really, really love what you work on. And I think I've been trying to do some soul searching after my PhD as well, now that I have this opportunity to start my own lab, like really figure out what is it that I love, and to start from there instead of anything like, oh, what do other people like, or what's going to get the most citations.
Very interesting indeed.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't too bad, right?
No, that was fun.
That's fun. All right, so that brings us to the end of our traditional Insight Blitz segment.
Okay.
And then we'll transition back over to the discussion at hand.
Coming up next, the second chapter in our series on AI and public health, where we continue the conversation with Dr. Serina Chang, shifting our focus to explore key terms and concepts such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, rule-based systems, and natural language processing, all in an attempt to unlock the connection between computer science and public health. That's next time on the Public Health Insight Podcast. This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art design for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media.
Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.